The church bells tolled not for joy but for endurance. Each peal seemed to mock the trembling bride standing at the altar, her hands clasped too tightly around a bouquet of pale garden roses. Lady Eleanor Whitmore had imagined her wedding 1,000 ways in girlhood, but never like this, never in a chill so profound it seemed to seep into her bones. Across from her stood the Duke of Ravenshire, tall, severe, his face a study in restraint. The man she was about to marry had not smiled once since entering the church. And as he recited his vows in a tone one might use to deliver a military report, she realized that love had no place in this ceremony. The congregation watched with an appetite only the cruelly idle could possess. The whispers were soft but merciless. The scholar's daughter, someone murmured, and him a duke. What a peculiar match. Another voice, dripping with disdain, followed, a pity he looks as though he's been sentenced. Eleanor heard every word. She stood motionless, her back straight, her chin lifted, not out of pride but defiance. She would not allow them to see the shatter forming behind her ribs. When the vows ended, the Duke did not look at her. He turned instead to the priest, offering a curt nod. The kiss, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a polite bow toward obligation. She could smell the starch of his collar but not the man beneath it. And in that fleeting, breathless moment she understood. She had married not a husband but a silence. Outside rain began to fall. Not a romantic drizzle, but a relentless, gray curtain that blurred the city's carriages and lamps. The wedding guests scurried beneath umbrellas, gossip trailing behind them like confetti. Eleanor's mother, pale and anxious, pressed a final kiss to her daughter's cheek before the Duke's carriage arrived. "You have done well," she whispered. "You will learn to be content." The words were a sentence, not a comfort. The journey to the Ravenshire townhouse was wordless. The Duke stared out the window, gloved fingers drumming once, twice, then stilling entirely. Eleanor tried to study him. The strong line of his jaw, the faint scar at his temple, the coldness that lived behind his eyes, but his face revealed nothing. If there was any trace of the man whispered about in London drawing rooms, the war hero, the strategist, the Duke who commanded both fear and fascination, it was locked behind a fortress she could not breach. The carriage rolled to a stop before a towering residence in Grosvenor Square. A butler waited with an umbrella, and 2 maids curtsied as she entered. The air inside smelled faintly of polish and rain-damp wool. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the flicker of gaslight. Eleanor removed her gloves, her wedding ring catching the light for the first time. It felt heavy, an ornament of belonging without warmth. Dinner was served, though neither ate. The Duke sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, the distance between them absurdly grand. When a servant poured wine into her glass, he raised his hand in quiet dismissal. "That will be all." His voice was deep, measured, entirely without gentleness. The servants vanished like ghosts. Eleanor tried to speak. "Your Grace," she began, the words trembling before she could steady them. "I hope I may be of some service to you here. I should like to make this house a home." He looked up briefly, eyes the color of storm water. "A home requires peace," he said. "I trust you will find yours." Then he returned his gaze to the untouched meal before him. The rest of the evening passed in a muted haze. She wandered through the drawing room, tracing her fingers along the piano she would not play tonight. Portraits of past dukes stared down from the walls, men with hard mouths and proud postures, each one seeming to measure her worth. She wondered if any of their wives had felt as she did now, alive in body, invisible in spirit. At last a maid appeared. "His Grace asks that your belongings be taken to the East Chamber," the girl said, her tone careful, apologetic. "He retires early." Eleanor's throat tightened. The East Chamber. Not his. Of course not. She thanked the maid softly and climbed the grand staircase alone. Her satin slippers barely whispered against the carpet. Every door she passed seemed to hum with the history of those who had walked before her. Women who had smiled and wept and learned to live behind closed doors. In her new chamber the fire had been laid. It cast a fragile glow across the white silk of her wedding gown, now creased and weary. She stood before the mirror and saw not a bride, but a portrait of quiet ruin. The roses in her hair had begun to wilt, their pale petals dropping one by one onto the floorboards. Hours passed. The clock chimed midnight. Still no sound came from the adjoining corridor. She undressed without ceremony, folding each piece of her bridal finery as though it belonged to someone else. Then, wrapped in a shawl, she sat by the fire and tried to remember what warmth once felt like. Through the walls, faintly, she could hear his footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. They paused outside her door, then receded down the hall. The silence that followed was absolute. It struck her suddenly that she did not even know his first name. The priest had spoken it during the ceremony, but she could not recall. Only Ravenshire. Only title, never man. She laughed, a soft, broken sound that startled even herself. Outside, the rain turned to wind. It rattled the panes and sent the firelight shivering across the room. Eleanor pressed her hand against her chest, where her heart beat like a trapped bird. Was this to be her life? Days measured by decorum, nights filled with the echo of footsteps that would never stop at her door? She rose and crossed to the window. The street below was empty save for a single carriage lamp swaying in the storm. Somewhere beyond the city, men still fought wars for glory. Here in this house, another kind of battle began, quieter, crueler, waged between loneliness and pride. Behind her, the door opened. She turned swiftly, breath-catching. The Duke stood there, half-shadowed by the flicker of the hearth. His expression was unreadable. "You should rest," he said, his tone distant. "Tomorrow there will be callers." She wanted to ask him why he married her, why he looked at her as though she were both his duty and his penance, but the words died on her tongue. He gave a small bow, almost imperceptible, then turned away. The door closed once more, final as a verdict. Eleanor sank onto the chair by the fire, her fingers trembling against the fabric of her gown. Somewhere within her, the first crack of understanding formed, not of love but of resolve. If this was to be her cage, she would learn to sing within it. Outside, the wind howled through London's sleeping streets. And in the corridor beyond her door, the Duke paused, just once, his hand resting against the wall as if to steady a heart that refused to feel. Then, in a voice meant for no one, he murmured, "No one is to disturb her grace. My duty to the crown is enough for one lifetime." The words drifted through the silence like a benediction and a curse. They called her the Duchess Ghost. The name began as a jest whispered over teacups, but by spring of the following year it had taken root in every drawing room from Mayfair to Bath. No one had seen her laugh or dance or even smile beside her husband. She existed, it was said, only as a pale wisp moving through corridors of polished silence. A wife untouched, unacknowledged, and unforgiven for the crime of being nothing more than dutiful. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, Duchess of Ravenshire, had become a story others told to feel superior. The tragedy of it was that she heard every word. Not directly, never from the mouths that curved into sympathy when they met her at soirees and luncheons, but through the rustle of silk, the too quiet hush that followed her entrance. She had learned to smile through it. The expression had become a kind of armor, elegant and serene, while beneath it her spirit dulled like an unused blade. Her husband, meanwhile, was the opposite of a ghost. The Duke of Ravenshire strode through London's corridors of power with measured confidence, his presence commanding, his name spoken in reverence. War had sharpened him into a man of precision, not affection. He spent his days in Parliament, his evenings in gentlemen's clubs where smoke and brandy masked whatever thoughts haunted him. To his peers he was a model of discipline, a figure restored from the chaos of battle. To Eleanor he was absence given form. Their marriage existed as a polite fiction. She managed the household, entertained the wives of ministers when required, and attended charity meetings. Her grace, her soft manner, her careful distance, these became her reputation. Once she might have found pride in being admired for dignity. Now it felt like applause at a funeral. On an evening in late May, as carriages clattered outside the Ravenshire townhouse, Eleanor prepared for yet another event, the annual ball at Lady Grenfell's. Her maid fastened a pearl clasp at her throat. In the mirror's reflection, the Duchess saw not herself but a portrait framed by expectation. When she arrived, every head turned. The whispers followed close behind. "So lovely, so wasted," someone sighed. It was there that Lord Kingsley approached her, a man known for charm that bordered on cruelty. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low, "London should erect a statue in your honor. It would be the only thing as beautiful and as still." The words were an arrow disguised as a compliment. She answered with the faintest smile. "And yet, my lord, statues are rarely invited to dance." He laughed too loudly, drawing attention. "Then allow me to be your sculptor. A dance for art's sake." Before she could refuse, he had already taken her hand. The orchestra swelled, the room seemed to pause. Around them, eyes glittered with anticipation. The Duchess of Ravenshire dancing with another man, how delicious a scandal. Eleanor moved with grace born of habit, not desire. Kingsley's hand lingered a fraction too long at her waist. His words brushed close to her ear. A woman so admired should not be so lonely. She felt the sting before she could summon restraint. "And a man so free should not be so careless," she replied. When the waltz ended, applause rippled. She withdrew with the poise of one accustomed to surviving small humiliations. But as she reached for her shawl, a voice stopped her. "Your Grace." The Duke had arrived, unexpected, imposing, his uniform's dark blue trimmed with gold. The crowd's chatter softened to a hush. He inclined his head politely to the hostess, then turned to his wife. "I was unaware you would be attending alone," he said. His tone was mild, but the air between them tightened. Eleanor met his gaze. "I was unaware you would be attending at all." For the first time in months, something flickered behind his calm facade, not anger exactly but something perilously close to it. "You find amusement easily, it seems." Her breath caught, but she refused to look away. "Only when forced to find it on my own." The silence that followed was sharper than any public argument could have been. The orchestra resumed, conversations restarted, but the damage was done. London's finest pretended not to watch as the Duke offered his arm, guiding his wife out with the practiced civility of a man escorting a stranger. In the carriage neither spoke. The horse's hooves struck rhythm into the tension between them. Finally he said, "Do you delight in giving the world cause to speak your name? Only because you never utter it yourself." He looked at her then, really looked. The words seemed to strike him harder than he had expected. "Eleanor," he said quietly, testing the sound as if it were foreign. Her eyes met his, startled by the softness that briefly surfaced before retreating. When they reached home, he left her without another word. She thought that was the end of it. But the next morning, a small envelope lay upon her writing desk. The handwriting, elegant, deliberate, was his. Inside was no letter, only a single pressed violet. Eleanor stared at it for a long while. The violet, the flower of modesty and faithfulness. A silent message, perhaps, or an apology too fragile for speech. She placed it between the pages of her journal, uncertain whether to treasure it or resent it. The days that followed passed with a strange new awareness. The Duke's absence no longer felt empty but weighted, charged. She caught him watching her once at breakfast, his expression unreadable. At dinner, when she spoke to the steward about estate accounts, he listened longer than necessary. It was as though something in the rhythm of their silence had shifted, ever so slightly. Still, the world outside remained merciless. The gossip deepened. Lord Kingsley, humiliated by her indifference, allowed his wounded pride to fester into rumor. "The Duchess," he told a friend too eager to repeat it, "seeks her husband's notice by inviting mine." Within days the tale spread like fire. Eleanor learned of it from her maid's hesitant whisper. Her face remained composed, but her stomach turned to ice. She knew what whispers could do, how swiftly pity turned to disdain. That evening, when the Duke returned from his club, she met him in the drawing room. "There is talk," she said softly. "Ugly talk." He regarded her in silence, the light from the hearth catching the edge of his scar. "Talk dies easily if ignored. And if it is not?" His jaw tightened. "Then it must be answered." She stepped closer. "How would you answer it, my lord? With silence as always?" The words escaped before she could stop them. His eyes flashed then cooled. "Careful, Eleanor. Silence is sometimes the only mercy left." She flinched, but he turned away, staring into the fire. For a moment she thought he would leave her standing there again. But instead, he reached into his coat and placed something on the mantelpiece, a single violet, freshly plucked. "Some things," he said quietly, "are worth defending." Then he left her to the flicker of the flames. The next morning, a letter arrived from the palace, a summons to Ravenshire Hall in the countryside. The Duke's political duties required his presence. The Duchess was expected to accompany him. Eleanor read the message twice, her pulse quickening. After a year of walls between them, she would be traveling alone with the man who had mastered the art of distance. Somewhere deep within her, a spark of dread mingled with something perilously like hope. In the hall below, the Duke's voice carried a calm command to his valet. "Have the carriage ready by dawn." And as the sound faded, Eleanor traced her fingers over the violet's fragile petals, whispering to the empty room, "Then let the world watch. Perhaps they will finally see the truth of us." The rain began before dawn, relentless and cold, drumming upon the carriage roof like a warning from heaven. By the time the wheels of the Ravenshire coach reached the moors, the world had turned to shadow and storm. Eleanor sat across from her husband, her gloved hands clasped in her lap, feeling every jolt of the road as though the earth itself sought to remind her she still lived. The Duke had said little since their departure. His gaze, fixed upon the window, reflected not the passing countryside but something far more distant. A battlefield, perhaps, or a memory he refused to release. The journey stretched long and wordless. Only once did he speak, his voice low, nearly lost to the rain. "The estate is quiet this time of year," he said, as if remarking on the weather. "You may find the solitude agreeable." Eleanor turned her face toward the grey horizon. "I have become well acquainted with solitude, your grace. I fear there is little novelty left in it." A flicker passed across his expression, pain or irritation she could not tell. Then silence reclaimed them, vast and unbroken. By afternoon Ravenshire Hall loomed into view, a vast stone relic crouched against the storm. Its windows were dim, its towers stoic, the great oak doors opening only as the carriage halted before them. Servants hurried forward, their greetings stiff with formality. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and dust. The portraits of Ravenshire's long dead gazed down from their gilded frames, their painted eyes cold and appraising. Eleanor curtsied out of habit as though to them. Her chamber overlooked the misted gardens. She unpacked in silence, then walked the corridor toward the library, drawn by the faint scent of tobacco and paper. She paused at the threshold. The Duke stood by the hearth, his jacket unbuttoned, his posture unguarded for the first time since she had known him. A letter trembled in his hand before he crushed it and tossed it into the fire. He looked up, startled to find her there. "You move quietly," he said. "I have had much practice." He studied her a long moment, then nodded toward the shelves. "My father's collection. You may find some comfort among them, if not company." She stepped inside. "Do you always imagine comfort to be found in the ghosts of others?" Something in her tone, gentle but edged, seemed to strike him. He exhaled slowly, eyes lowering. "The dead are simpler than the living. They ask nothing." "Then I am very much alive," she said softly, and left before he could answer. That night the storm worsened. Thunder rolled through the valley, the wind moaned across the chimneys. Eleanor could not sleep. The loneliness that had followed her for a year pressed heavier in this ancient place, as though the walls themselves mourned. She rose, wrapped herself in a shawl, and wandered the corridor. The house was dark save for a single strip of light beneath the library door. Curiosity, or perhaps defiance, led her to it. Through the narrow crack she saw him again, seated at the desk, head bowed over a small leather-bound book. The firelight gilded his hair, softened the harsh line of his jaw. For the first time he looked human. Vulnerable. She should have turned away, but the sight rooted her. When at last he lifted the book and she glimpsed its contents, a sketch of two figures, one unmistakably herself, her breath caught. He closed it abruptly, sensing movement, but by then she was gone. The next morning dawned brittle and pale. She took her breakfast alone, pretending not to notice that his chair remained empty. Hours later, while exploring the gallery, she found a locked door at the end of the corridor. A maid passing by hesitated when asked. "His Grace keeps that room private?" the girl whispered. "Since the war." The war. Always the invisible third presence between them. She thanked the maid and turned away, though her mind lingered on the locked door and the look she had seen in his eyes the night before, a look that seemed less cruel than haunted. By evening the tension between them had shifted. Over dinner, he surprised her by asking, "Do you find the country dull, Duchess?" "Peaceful," she replied. "Though peace and loneliness often share a face." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You have a talent for turning comfort into accusation. Only when comfort is given in half measures." He laughed then, quietly, bitterly. "You would make a fine soldier, Eleanor. You fight without weapons and yet you wound cleanly." She looked at him across the candlelight. "And you, my lord, fight ghosts while the living starve for your attention." The words hung between them, trembling like flame. Neither spoke again. That night, she wrote in her journal. "He feels too much and pretends to feel nothing. I feel everything and must pretend it is enough." The confession did not ease her. When she closed the book, dizziness overtook her. The fire blurred. A sudden weakness crept through her limbs. She reached for the bell but could not find it. When the Duke entered, summoned by a servant's alarm, he found her collapsed beside the chair, her face white as the linen on her bed. Panic, real and unrestrained, crossed his features. He lifted her gently, his voice low and unsteady. "Eleanor. Eleanor, open your eyes." She stirred faintly, murmuring something he could not catch. He pressed a hand to her forehead. "Fever." He barked orders to the housekeeper, his composure unraveling with each heartbeat. Hours passed in fevered blur. The physician was sent for, but still he refused to leave her side. At one point she whispered his name, his given name, through cracked lips. Julian. He froze. No one had spoken it in months. I am here, he answered. Rest, my love. The words escaped him before he could recall them. They hung in the air, fragile, half-believed. She sighed, drifting between sleep and delirium. You need not love me, she whispered. Only see me. He bowed his head, shame and tenderness warring in his chest. Forgive me, Eleanor. I have seen nothing else since the day I met you. Through the long night, he sat by her bed, cooling her brow, whispering half-remembered prayers. When at last the fever broke near dawn, he slumped forward in exhaustion, her small hand still enclosed within his. The morning light crept slowly across the room, finding them thus, she stirring, he asleep beside her chair, his head bowed against their joined hands. For the first time she studied him without fear or resentment. The hardness had lifted from his face, revealing not cruelty but sorrow, deep and old. She wanted to wake him, to thank him, to ask what pain had turned love into silence, but she could not. Her strength was spent. Instead, she watched the steady rise and fall of his shoulders, the faint tremor in his breath, and wondered if perhaps this too was a kind of beginning. Outside the storm had passed. The air smelled of wet earth and renewal. Somewhere a clock began to chime. The Duke stirred, his eyes opening to find hers upon him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, softly as though confessing to the morning itself, he said, You were never meant to suffer for my ghosts. Her lips parted, but before she could answer, the door creaked open. A servant stepped in with a sealed letter, bearing the royal crest. The Duke's hand tightened around hers once, briefly, as though he feared to let go. Then, with a voice gone suddenly cold, he said, Send it to my study. No one is to disturb her grace. And though he stood to leave, she knew something had changed. The silence between them no longer felt empty, it felt alive, waiting. The letter from the crown arrived like a blade through still water. It sat upon the Duke's desk, unassuming, its wax seal cracked beneath his trembling thumb. The words inside were few, but they struck with the force of a musket. Lord Ashcombe, his father's oldest friend, his commanding officer in the Peninsula War, was dead. And with his death came the unraveling of a secret Julian Ravenshire had spent years burying beneath duty and distance. The crown required his presence in London immediately, to account for matters that should have stayed forgotten. Soldiers gone missing, money untraced, and a betrayal whispered in the corridors of Whitehall. He stared at the fire until the ink blurred before him. The past had found him as it always did, with perfect precision. Behind him, the faint creak of the door. You received news? Eleanor's voice was soft, hesitant, like one approaching a wounded animal. He did not turn. I did. Bad news. The worst kind. The kind that arrives too late to change anything. She took a step closer, her hand brushing the carved edge of his desk. Will you tell me? No, he said sharply, then forced his tone to gentleness. Not yet. Her silence lingered, thoughtful and wounded. Then she said, You cannot keep every grief locked inside you, Julian. Eventually, it poisons what little is left. He lifted his eyes at last, and she saw the exhaustion etched into him, the lines carved by sleepless years, the shadows beneath his gaze. You speak as if you have not lived beside poison yourself, he murmured. I have, she replied. And I've learned it kills slower when shared. That night, when the house had gone still, he packed for London. She watched from the doorway, uncertain whether to stop him or let him go. He paused only once to look at her reflection in the window. When I return, he said quietly, everything will be different. Different, she repeated. Better? He hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. Or worse. He left before dawn. Days passed in uneasy quiet. The echo of his absence filled every corridor. Eleanor found herself moving through Ravenshire Hall like a ghost, tidying rooms he had touched, standing at windows where he had once stood, listening to the wind in place of his voice. She told herself she did not miss him, that she was only lonely because silence had become her sole companion. Yet every night she found her thoughts drifting to the way he had whispered her name as she lay fevered, or how his fingers had trembled when he held her hand. One evening, as she wandered through the gallery, she paused before a painting she had never truly noticed, a battlefield scene, dark and violent. Amid the chaos, two figures were rendered in detail, the Duke, unmistakably, and another man beside him, his features half obscured by smoke. The inscription read, Lord Ashcombe at Talavera. Her heart quickened. So this was the man from the letter. The name felt heavy with something unspoken, and she began to sense that whatever bound her husband to this ghost was not merely loyalty but guilt. The next morning brought confirmation. A messenger arrived, mud-spattered and breathless, bearing a note sealed with the Duke's hand. It was addressed to her alone. She broke it open, her pulse racing. "Eleanor," it began. "If this reaches you, I beg of you, do not come to London. What waits here is not safe. There are matters I cannot explain, things I once did for king and country that now rise to devour me. Remember only this, should word reach you that I am disgraced, believe none of it. My sins are mine alone, and none were ever yours to bear. J.R." Her breath caught. Disgraced? Devoured? The words rang like prophecy. She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the parchment tremble against her heartbeat. For a moment she considered obeying, but something stronger than fear stirred within her. The Eleanor who had once sat quietly at balls, ignored and forgotten, was gone. This Eleanor had stood at the edge of his ghosts and seen the man beneath them. By nightfall she ordered a carriage. The journey to London was grueling, the roads thick with autumn mud and the smell of smoke from distant fires. At every inn she passed whispers of unrest, an inquiry at the War Office, names of noblemen dragged through scandal. By the time she reached Grosvenor Square, her dress was creased, her gloves ruined, and her resolve unshaken. She arrived at their London residence unannounced. The butler, pale with surprise, tried to bar her entry. His Grace instructed. "I am his wife," she said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. "And if you value your position, you will take me to him at once." The man hesitated, then bowed. "Very well, Your Grace. But, be prepared. His Grace is not himself." She found Julian in the drawing-room, surrounded by papers, his cravat undone, his eyes bloodshot. The sight of her froze him mid-motion. "Eleanor," he breathed, "you shouldn't be here." "And yet I am," she said, stepping closer. "Because I will not spend another night wondering whether the man I married has gone to his grave, or worse, his ruin." He laughed bitterly. "Then you may witness both. The inquiry convenes tomorrow. They believe I conspired to falsify troop accounts, to conceal the deaths of men under my command." She swallowed hard. "Is it true?" His silence was answer enough. "I thought you hated me," she whispered. "But all this time, it was yourself you could not forgive." He turned away, gripping the mantle until his knuckles whitened. "Ashcombe ordered those men forward when the ground was lost. I countermanded him, to save what lives I could. He called it treason. The Crown calls it cowardice. There was no victory left that day, Eleanor, only survival, and I chose it." Her eyes filled with tears. "And now they would punish you for mercy." He met her gaze then, something breaking in him. "Mercy has no place in a soldier's ledger." She crossed the room, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Then let it live here," she said, pressing his palm against her heart. "In us. Whatever comes, you will not face it alone." For a long time neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere beyond the windows, London's carriages rumbled through the fog. Then, as though drawn by something inevitable, he bent his forehead to hers. No words passed between them, only breath, shared and trembling. When at last he drew back, his expression had changed. There was steel beneath the sorrow. "If I fall tomorrow, you must leave the city at once. Promise me that." She shook her head. "I have spent years being silent and safe. I would rather speak and be ruined beside you." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she had seen in months. "You were never meant to be ordinary, Eleanor." The clock struck midnight. They stood together in its echo, two souls suspended on the edge of dawn. Then, without warning, a knock shattered the stillness, hard, insistent. Julian stiffened. "They shouldn't be here so soon." She turned toward the door, but he caught her arm. "Stay behind me." The butler's voice came muffled through the wood. "Your Grace, a rider from the palace. Urgent." Julian's pulse thundered in his throat. He opened the door to receive the letter, his hands unsteady. The messenger bowed and vanished into the fog. He broke the seal, read once, then again, his face draining of color. Eleanor stepped forward, dread gripping her. "What is it?" He looked at her, his voice hollow. "Ashcombe's death was no accident. They think I killed him." The paper slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. The verdict came with the weight of iron. The gavel struck once, and the sound rippled through the chamber like a funeral bell. "Guilty," declared the voice of Parliament's inquiry, each syllable deliberate, unforgiving. The Duke of Ravenshire, war hero, nobleman, husband, was condemned not to death, but to disgrace, stripped of his military command and sentenced to exile from the king's council. The world did not require his blood. It merely required his name to be ruined. Eleanor sat at the back of the gallery, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles blanched beneath silk. She had braced herself for humiliation, but not for the quiet cruelty of it, the way the crowd whispered as though pity were more cutting than hatred. As the officials rose, Julian remained seated, staring at nothing. Only when the room emptied did he lift his eyes toward her. He looked neither defeated nor defiant, merely emptied of breath, as if something vital had been pulled from him and left to die in the echo of that word. Outside the air was thick with fog. Reporters lingered like scavengers. Eleanor reached him before they could. "We must leave," she said softly. He looked at her as though the world were very far away. "I told you not to come." "You told me many things," she replied. "None of them stopped me before." They walked together in silence through Westminster's deserted corridors, the echo of their footsteps too loud in the hollow grandeur. When they emerged into the carriage yard, she caught his sleeve. "Julian, tell me it isn't true." He hesitated. "It doesn't matter what's true anymore. It only matters what England believes." Her throat tightened. "And what do you believe?" "That I deserved every punishment they gave me. I let men die. I let you wait. I let everything rot." Her heart broke for the quiet in his voice, the surrender of a man who had once commanded armies. "You did what you could to save them," she said fiercely. "And you have not lost me." He turned toward her, his face lit only by the faint glow of the carriage lamps. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I killed Ashcombe." The word struck her like cold wind. She blinked once, disbelieving. "You, what?" "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice rough. "It was the night before we returned from Spain. He threatened to expose me, to name me a coward in front of the regiment. He said I disobeyed the crown. I struck him just once. He fell. His head." He stopped, breath shaking. "I buried it beneath silence. And England made me a duke." The world around her dimmed. She reached out, steadying herself against the carriage door. "Why tell me now?" "Because I cannot let you share the ruin of a lie. When they come for me next, and they will, I want you far from it." "You think I would leave you now?" she whispered. "After all the nights I waited for a man who would not touch me? After learning he had a heart too heavy to lift?" His hand trembled as he brushed a tear from her cheek. "You are too good for the world, Eleanor. Too good for me. Then let me be ruined with you," she said. But he was already turning away toward the waiting carriage. The following morning, London woke to rain. Ravenshire House stood silent, its windows shuttered, its hearths cold. The Duke had vanished before dawn. No one saw him go, only that his horse was gone from the stable, his ring from his hand, and a sealed letter addressed to his wife lay upon his pillow. Eleanor tore it open, her vision blurring as she read. "Do not seek me. My name will die where it began, in Ravenshire. You once said poison kills slower when shared. I can no longer let you drink it with me. Live Eleanor. Live as if I never caged you within my ghost." She sank to the floor, the letter crumpling in her grasp. For hours she sat unmoving. Then slowly she rose. By nightfall she had left London behind. The journey to Ravenshire was a blur of storm and memory. The rain came in relentless sheets, soaking her cloak, numbing her hands, but she pressed on. Each mile pulled her further from society's whispers and closer to the truth she could no longer fear. When she reached the estate, lightning illuminated the manor, dark, unlit, and eerily still. She entered through the side door, her footsteps echoing in vast emptiness. The scent of smoke lingered faintly in the air, and something deep within her twisted in dread. "Julian?" Her voice trembled through the hall. "It's me." Silence. Then, a sound. From the drawing room. She followed it, her skirts dragging damp across the marble. When she opened the door, the fire was dying in the grate. And there he was, seated in the armchair, his head bowed, his hands clasped as though in prayer. For one terrible moment she thought he was gone. Then his voice came low and ragged. "I told you not to come." She stepped closer. "And yet, as ever, I did." He lifted his face and she saw what the inquiry had taken from him. His eyes, once fierce and unyielding, were hollowed by shame. Yet beneath the ruin, there was still the man she had married, the one who had held her hand when fever nearly claimed her, the one who had whispered her name as though it were salvation. She knelt beside him. "If you mean to die here," she said quietly, "then you will take me with you." His breath caught. "Don't say that. I have nothing left to lose but you." He closed his eyes, shaking his head. There is no forgiveness for what I've done. Then let me forgive you, she whispered. Let me love you where the world will not. The rain beat harder against the windows. Thunder rolled across the moors. For a long time he said nothing. Then, with a broken sigh, he reached for her hand. His fingers were cold, trembling. You should hate me, he said. Perhaps I will, she murmured. Tomorrow. He gave a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. Tomorrow, he echoed. They stayed there until the fire died, until the storm quieted and dawn began to seep through the drapes. It was then, in that fragile light, that she felt his hand slacken in hers. Panic seized her. Julian? He stirred faintly. I'm so tired, Eleanor. No, she said, gripping him tighter. Stay with me. But he only smiled, faintly, his gaze fixed on some far horizon. You made me breathe again, he whispered. Even if it was only once. And then with that breath he was gone. Eleanor's cry broke the morning stillness. She pressed her face to his chest, listening for a heartbeat that would not return. Outside, the storm gave way to sunlight, pale and cold, spreading across the moors like mercy. By the time the servants found them, she was motionless beside him, her hand resting where his heart had been. And though the world would write that the Duke of Ravenshire died disgraced, those who entered that quiet room swore they saw peace upon his face, and a faint smile upon hers, as if she had followed him at last, into the silence where neither duty nor sorrow could touch them again.